Can you hear me? Maybe not. Can you hear me? I don't think so. Okay, so. Can you hear me? No. The green light, yes. Well, it's 3 o'clock. Do you want to give them a few more minutes?
The lapels are much quieter than the non-lapels.
Right, but we're not using lapels right now.
Which lapel is that?
I'm happy to use that one.
You're not going to use that?
No, I am going to use that.
Okay, that's what
I'm used to that.
Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. We've got microphones and we've got lapels. I did not test that right there. I would recommend one of the lapels today. I'm not sure where they've gotten to.
Yeah, I need it to be loud.
Testing, testing. No, I don't. Well, I don't have any control of this speaker. So we're gonna. I've got the mics I can control right here, but I'm not.
Where's the lapel mic?
Yeah, where's the lapel mic?
Does this mic work?
Test, test.
You're kidding, I have to use that.
Apparently we didn't test the room, and the room speakers are just as quiet as everything else was.
Testing, testing. That's good. Okay.
Off them so we don't get an echo.
Oh, we're not getting any sound through that right now.
Testing. I don't know. Hopefully, does that sound? Can you hear me? I mean, this is really. Well, I normally yell, so.
We're about ready to start. If you can all come and take your seats. Okay. So I'm Judy Russell. I'm the Dean of University Libraries here at the University of Florida, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this special event introducing the collection of photojournalist Andrew Szentgyorgyi. I really am grateful that you've all joined us this afternoon. This collection is a gift of his son Andrew Szentgyorgyi, and we're fortunate that he and his brother Tom are both with us today, sitting there in the front row, and they'll be joining Lily a little later on the platform. This collection consists primarily of photographs and other mixed media that their father, working under the name Andrew Szentgyorgyi, took throughout his professional career, and includes some of his most valuable and famous published images. There are over 8,000 photographic prints, negatives, slides, contact sheets, as well as manuscripts, documents, and other ephemera. Highlights from the collection are displayed in the cabinets at the back of the room, and additional images are going to be included in the presentation, which you'll see shortly. Our presenter today is my friend and colleague, Lillian Guerra, professor of Cuban and Caribbean history and the director of the Cuba program here at the University of Florida. She's responsible for encouraging the donation of this extremely important collection to the University of Florida, and we're deeply indebted to her and the donors for entrusting us with the preservation and use of this Andrew Szentgyorgyi's work. Her student assistant, Amber Thiel, who's also here today, there's Amber. Yay. Lily and she spent hours preparing a detailed inventory that's going to facilitate discovery and use of these items. soon as we release the collection, but also long into the future. Lily used the depth of her personal knowledge of the people and events represented in the collection to identify many of the individuals and events in the photographs, making them much more discoverable and accessible. The libraries will be digitizing many of these images for public access and preservation, and will use the details Lily provided to accurately identify them. Entitled Witness to the Revolution, Cuba and the Photography of Andrew Szentgyorgyi, Dr. Guerra's presentation will provide an overview of the life and work of Andrew Szentgyorgyi, one of the most prolific and historically important photojournalists of the 20th century. The primary focus of the presentation will be on his documentation of democratic struggles against dictatorship in Cuba, as well as the Caribbean and Latin America, more broadly, from the 50s through the early 70s. She's also going to describe Szentgyorgyi's early experiences in the Hungarian underground movement, the Hungarian underground movement against the Nazis and fascism, as well as his service as the head of a war crimes unit in the U.S. military intelligence following World War II. After her presentation, Andrew and Tom will join her on the stage for a discussion and to respond to your questions. Thank you again for coming. Welcome, Lily. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. So before I get started, I need to know that you can hear me. Can everybody hear me? Good. So Cubans speak very loudly. That's going to be of benefit. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to the handful, really a handful of people who have made the acquisition of the Andrew Szentgyorgyi collection possible. First and foremost, I want to thank Andrew Szentgyorgyi, who is really Andrew Jr., for his extraordinary generosity and confidence in the seriousness of my scholarship. I first got to know his father's work in 2004, so it has been 20 years. I never knew just how deep and extensive that body of work was until he reached out to me a couple of years ago. So he and his family, Nancy Brickhouse and their son Nick, not only hosted me in their home for several days last December 2022, but also in August of 2023, and put up with my insatiable appetite for more knowledge, photographs, explanations, stories. Thanks as well go to Tom Szentgyorgyi, who has added to his brother's already extraordinary donation even more unique material. I want to thank you on behalf of the University of Florida, and most importantly on behalf of the people who are really unknown to us and who will discover their history all over again through this incredible donation. The collection now we have an estimate of about 9,000 photographs, 90% of which have never been published. And they span Cuba, the Caribbean, and Latin America, as I'll get to in a second. I also want to thank Seth Bernstein, Natalia Alexian, who are my colleagues in the Department of History and who have made me something of a greater expert on Hungarian history, and a wonderful historian named Esther Varos, who helped me in Hungary, in Budapest. I also want to finally thank all of my students, Dave, my son Elias, for putting up with my endless stories about the Andrew Szentgyorgyi collection, and I hope to rivet you today with some of them. So I shall begin. In late December 2022, I returned to the University of Florida after completing the first of 2 visits to the home of Andrew Szentgyorgyi's oldest son and his family in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Filling my backpack and the one personal item I carried on the plane at the Boston airport were dozens of colored slides, over 100 black and white prints, gems of personal correspondence, and the first 2 hours of a filmed oral history with Szentgyorgyi's oldest son, which he later called our Vulcan mind meld. To the delight of the otherwise bored and apparently overeducated TSA staff, I also carried nearly 1,000 packets of pristinely preserved negatives, most in their original sleeves. Holding several up to the light, a TSA officer called his colleagues over. "Wow, is that Fidel Castro? Who took these amazing pictures?" My response was uncharacteristically short. Andrew Szentgyorgyi, one of the most important but forgotten photographers of the late 20th century. "So what's in the rest of the negatives?" asked an eavesdropping passenger. At the time, I had no idea. Nobody did. Less than a week later, my $184 Kodak slide and scan began to reveal thousands of never-before-seen and almost entirely unpublished images that Andrew Szentgyorgyi made of some of the most dramatic paradigm-shifting events in the first 2 decades of Latin America's Cold War. Meticulously documented, over thousands of pictures were not just individuals like Fidel Castro, who appointed themselves the saviors of others, but also political reformers who wanted to broaden the Cold War's binary of communism versus capitalism in the name of positive social change. Shot principally in Cuba, Miami, New York, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, and Brazil, his images recovered and opened up whole social worlds in ways we had not seen before. In these worlds, protest, resistance, violence, community, anger, fear, and faith coexisted with an impending urgency and an irrepressible sense of hope. Yet the hope Andrew identified as the most relevant emotional protagonist in the faces and gestures of those who propelled the course of history was never just hope. In pictures of Cubans, both those who fought Cuba's dictator Fulgencio Batista in the 1950s and those who would fight Fidel Castro in the 1960s, hope was an aspirational duty. Men and women seeking freedom, sovereignty, and justice faced a daily task of examining their own consciousness and assessing the degree of personal sacrifice they might have to make in order to achieve their great national goals. In collective portraits of Americans in Harlem who lined the streets to see Fidel Castro and the Cuban delegation to the United Nations over their historic September 1960 visit, hope surges forth. Puerto Ricans, African Americans, and deeply divided Cubans from New York envisioned the potential for reversing the injustices of history and glimpsed the apparent evidence that revolutions, whatever their goals, make the impossible seem possible. In images of Brazil and Venezuela, made after the 1959 Cuban Revolution adopted communism, Szentgyorgyi tracked the long, seductive trail of Cuba's mythical triumph and socialist utopia. Hope galvanizes righteousness in his portraits of Francisco Julião, the socialist congressman who fought for agrarian reform in Brazil's desperately poor Northeast before a CIA-brokered coup installed a military dictatorship in 1964 that lasted until 1986. Szentgyorgyi made dozens of pictures of Fabricio Ojeda, a journalist who fought Venezuela's military dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez in the 50s and helped reestablish democracy as an elected congressman in 1958. Andrew's camera portrayed him in 1960 as a family man and humble activist. At the time, Ojeda stood on the verge of a political precipice, and one wonders if Andrew knew it. Only months after the interview, Ojeda resigned his post and founded a guerrilla movement in imitation of Fidel Castro, only to be captured and ultimately tortured to death in the dungeons of Venezuela's military in 1966. Looking back, our knowledge of the tragic events of the Latin American Cold War now lend Andrew Szentgyorgyi's inspirational portraits a palpably prophetic, ironic cast. Yet Andrew's pictures have their own agency. They reveal a fight, a just fight, among the poor majority for a third path between communism and the ever-resilient monopoly capitalism that long benefited only Latin America's super elites, U.S. investors, and corrupt governments. Even among the stiff-necked soldiers of a U.S. military occupation of the Dominican Republic in 1965, the suspicious glances of impoverished Dominican bystanders and defiant female protesters, there is also hope. But in Andrew's photographs, we see that hope laced with imperial arrogance and despair. Hope was the great protagonist in Andrew Szentgyorgy's photography. Quote, "There is burning urgency in the humanitarian design to alleviate the wretched lot of the poor, who are often needy and helpless beyond our imagination," wrote Andrew Szentgyorgyi in July 1963. Quote, "Mere words cannot truly bring alive the plight of the land-working serfs in, say, Peru or Bolivia, or of the slum squatters in the pestilent shantytowns of Caracas or Rio de Janeiro. In the countryside, millions of forgotten people not only live outside the kind of economy we know, but are outside of our epoch, the mid-20th century," unquote. His article predicted the failure of John F. Kennedy's Alliance for Progress to ameliorate the grinding poverty that characterized the massive agricultural estates dominating Latin America. His words indicted the foreign companies which, through their unbridled greed, often shackled Latin American populations to poverty. By 1963, Andrew Szentgyorgyi was a battle-hardened but not embittered journalist. He had spent 5 years witnessing revolution in Cuba and Fidel Castro's betrayal of his own 26th of July movement to ally with communists who had not fought the dictator Batista, and then he adopted communism. Over time, as Szentgyorgy's photography meticulously documented the ever-narrowing space for political pluralism and ideological binary that defined the Cold War, he himself became journalism's Cassandra, the seer of Greek mythology, whom Apollo fated to utter true prophecies that were never to be believed. Almost always edited out of contemporary magazines or newspapers' simplifying frames, Andrew's soul-searching gaze captured an array of characters. The list is long and varied. It includes Cuba's anonymous guerrillas, euphoric citizens, self-appointed messiahs, revolutionaries, civilians, defiant exiles, as well as legendary world figures and characters caught in the act of encountering revolution and revolutionary Cuba. These leaders include Egypt's anti-colonial president, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Look at the people. Thousands showed up to see him and Fidel in Harlem. India's first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Brazilian soccer legend Pelé. Writer and fisherman Ernest Hemingway. Sports hero Jackie Robinson. Richard Gibson, the black intellectual nobody knew was a secret CIA informant for decades. The yet unknown Malcolm X, standing at 3 o'clock in the morning under a street light to meet with Fidel Castro. All of them came to Harlem during Fidel's 10-day stay to address the United Nations. And then there is Juanita Castro. Upon arrival in Mexico in 1964, after being released from house arrest for working with the CIA. First Lady of Brazil, Maria Goulart, shortly before her government was deposed by military coup. But Andrew's specialty lay in his ability to immerse himself, and now those who view his photographs in massive crowds, illuminating a human landscape of diverse, complex, fascinating emotions. So I have a series I'll just show you. This is taken the same day as the previous photograph, January 22nd, 1959. More than 1 million Cubans showed up to prove to the world that they were in favor of the executions of Batista's war criminals, who had tortured or disappeared at least 3,000 civilian and armed fighters in the military underground against him, along with 200 guerrillas. Then there are the live studio audience appearances during Fidel's sometimes 6-hour-long appearances on TV. And this show was his favorite, Ante la Prensa, 1960. There you see a very bored Che Guevara. Next to him, Raul Castro. You skip one person who I haven't identified, and you see Aleida March, who is Che's wife. And on the other side of Che, you skip that next woman we don't have identified yet, and there is the former president of Cuba, Prioso Corrás, who was deposed by Batista in 1952. This photograph was taken in March of 60. Oops, something bad happened. I think, there we go. I love these. Press conferences. This one on the tarmac at Idlewood Airport after concluding his visit to the United Nations. You can see the entire Cuban delegation, including Carlos Franchi, Guillermo Cabrera Infante, Ramiro Valdés, Juan Almeida, you name it. And for each one of the Cubans, there seem to be like 2 cops. And then there are these amazing pictures of the Miami exile movement. Here they have received the body of an anti-Castro Cuban executed in Cuba, returned for burial, and they are stitching together an American flag with a Cuban flag over his coffin. You have similar amazing pictures of rallies like this one, called by the Socialist Party in Brazil in 1962. Look at the faces. There is a frenetic cinematographic quality to the pace at which Andrew aimed and fired his camera. Rather than document a few impassioned moments of a speech by Fidel Castro, for example, over the course of what were inevitably several hours, Andrew snapped hundreds of frames within half an hour, frame after frame after frame. You can see Fidel move. He would change his angle, adopting different perspectives from amidst the crowd. He forces the viewer to join him as witness and relive the drama. This technique drives such emotional and political complexity that it overwhelms one's capacity for bias, generating a curious form of empathy. We want to know more because Andrew always wanted to know more. Simplicity was never a universe Andrew Szentgyorgyi wanted to explore. If Andrew Szentgyorgyi insisted on political and emotional complexity, however, his spin-savvy editors banked on simplicity. Who was Andrew Szentgyorgyi? Born in Budapest on October 5th, 1923, Andrew grew up in a household defined by an abundance of marvelously crafted food, the speaking of multiple languages, and high intellectual expectations for both him, then known as András, and his younger brother, Tamás. By his own account, recorded by Andrew Szentgyorgyi and his wife on January 9, 2001, his childhood and adolescence wound themselves around a solid spool of comfort and happiness that also concealed a number of family secrets. Known as one of Hungary's principal architects, responsible for many public buildings and private palaces and the bathhouses in Budapest, Andrew's grandfather and his father, Gyula, were famous. Gyula was almost 30 years older, however, than Andrew's mother, Eva, his dad's second wife. Gyula's decorated service in World War I, which cost Hungary 2/3 of its territory and more than 600,000 men's lives, also left Gyula with a glass eye. Andrew knew nothing of it until, as a little boy, rifling through drawers, he found a spectacular velvet box that contained his dad's equally impressive spare glass eye. But there were other secrets. In the 19-teens, at the height of Hungary's state campaign to culturally purify the nation, commonly known as Hungarianization, both his father and his mother legally changed their last names. Only his mother's decision proved haunting. At ages 18 and 16, respectively, Andrew and Thomas learned of it in 1941 when they went to the Nazi-backed Hungarian government's ethnic registration office. There, they were shocked to discover what their Catholic upbringing and their parents' silence had denied. Eva, their mom, was Jewish. Her original last name was not Horvath, it was Horowitz. In many ways, that singular revelation reshaped and propelled the rest of Andrew Szentgyorgy's life. In the short run, public knowledge of his matrilineal Jewish ancestry seemed to have a greater effect on a young Andrew's political activism and attitudes than on his prospects. Enrolled in law school at his father's insistence, he nonetheless got himself a job as a journalist at Esti Kurid, Hungary's liberal newspaper covering the police beat. He also translated a weekly editorial by Nazi Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, into a Hungarian parody of itself. When Nazi security troops occupied Hungary in March of 1944, Szentgyorgyi initially conceded to hiding in the guise of a candidate priest in a Franciscan monastery in northern Hungary, a plan his father arranged. But less than 6 months later, by July of 1944, he left the monks to join the Hungarian resistance. Ultimately, he worked for the legendary Swedish ambassador Raoul Wallenberg, who drafted thousands of fake Swedish passports and employment papers so that Jews and other Hungarians could escape death in Nazi concentration camps. Szentgyorgyi also began publishing an underground newspaper called, forgive my Hungarian, Marciusi Front, the March Front, which he himself described as a, quote, 6-page anti-Nazi firebrand mimeographed in a bare apartment and circulated through the mails in innocuous business envelopes, unquote. Ultimately arrested, released, and rearrested by the Hungarian equivalent of the Gestapo, Szentgyorgyi was, according to U.S. military intelligence files, quote, jailed, interrogated, and condemned to death. The Allied victory saved his life, unquote. In May of 1945, U.S. Army Colonel Walter G. Rischel awarded Szentgyorgyi a citation for, quote, significant contributions to the cause of Hungary's liberation, unquote, in an open-air ceremony before the U.S. Embassy. Szentgyorgyi went on to be a senior war crimes investigator, overseeing a 9-member team capturing Nazi war criminals in Hungary until 1946, and then until 1952, an intelligence officer of the Special Operations Branch of the 430th Counterintelligence Corps Detachment in Vienna, also seeking war criminals. Despite Andrew Szentgyorgyi's well-earned reputation for bravery and moral courage, surviving essays he wrote in 1953 to 54 while pursuing a degree in comparative literature at Columbia University speak of a terrible haunting, always close to his heart. In an essay entitled, for which he got an A, by the way, I have lived through much history. Andrew listed and described 6 friends and martyrs, all killed in different ways by the Nazis. He ended the essay with this statement, quote, my contempt to you, history, lunatic destroyer, do you think that benefit concerts or declarations about the future of civilization will bring back the dead? Do you think that those of us whom you have permitted to survive will forget that you destroyed the best among us? Look at me. I, for one, will never forget. Surely, the greatest witness of Szentgyorgyi's commitment to not forgetting and seeking truth, whatever the cost, was the history of revolutionary Cuba itself. By his own account, Cuba's revolution made me a pro. In February of 1957, Herbert Matthews' 3-part scoop in the New York Times disproving the Cuban dictator's claim that Fidel Castro was dead struck Szentgyorgyi like a bolt of lightning. In his quest to get a bigger and better story in Cuba through a longer stay, Andrew quickly gained the support of Cavalier, a men's magazine, to cover the costs of travel, film, and most of his camera equipment. CBS covered the costs of what turned out to be an enormous portable CBS tape recording machine to tape an interview of Fidel Castro. Before leaving for Cuba in early April 1957, he also successfully contracted a female literary agent. Clearly, Szentgyorgyi knew that in Cuba, he not only had a story, but he had the makings to launch a top-notch career. He wasn't wrong. By early March 1959, only 3 months after the opposition's moral victory over Batista led the 26th of July movement to establish a revolutionary government, St. George told Diario de la Marina, the island's oldest newspaper, that he had already taken between 8,000 and 10,000 photographs of Cuba. Indeed, no other journalist spent more time in the Sierra Maestra documenting Cuba's developing revolution than St. George. Starting in April of '57, St. George made 6 trips to the Sierra, none of them less than a month, several of them lasting several months, the longest lasting 3. One of his photographs, which he sold to the Associated Press for only $15, was subsequently distributed and republished 120 times. Unlike Matthews or even CBS's Bob Tabor, with whom St. George collaborated, St. George was the first to describe what life was like among members of Fidel Castro's guerrilla. He was an embedded reporter, a war correspondent, decades before that terminology even existed. Quote, "The guerrilla army moves at least once every 24 hours. To do away with permanent headquarters, it carries every last bullet and bean on its groaning back. There are no beds, no tents, no pack animals, no changes of sweat-stiffened clothing," he wrote in October 1957's edition of Cavalier. Daily jungle marches of 10 to 20 miles with field packs. They inevitably follow. Burlap sacks with makeshift shoulder straps weighing between 65 and 75 pounds, plus a firearm and full ammo supply. These speak of physical feats not easily believed until you happen to have seen them yourself or accomplished them as I have, unquote. Left unpublished were Andrew's eyewitness manuscripts describing toothacheing Fidel Castro's submission to a foot-driven dental drill made out of old bicycle wheels. Also unpublished was a harrowing personal account of the 26th of July guerrillas' takeover of a peasant hut in order to place and detonate a roadside bomb. Photographs meant to punctuate these stories were not published, but we have them, leaving these things unreported. Yet St. George was the first to truly record and publish a strikingly accurate biography of Fidel Castro's prior life and detailed account of his steps to lead to revolution. Landing first that recorded interview with Castro was not easy. After more than 2 weeks in the Sierra Maestra, Comandante Castro's efforts to make St. George wait began to embarrass and ultimately ashamed the camp doctor, an Argentine and self-proclaimed Marxist named Ernesto Che Guevara, who pressured Fidel to concede. As Cuba's summer monsoon began every afternoon, Che and Andrew, quote, spent many days huddled under a diaper-sized plastic sheet, talking and arguing to beat off the misery of those endless tropical downpours, unquote. Under the same torrential rains, Andrew later remembered privately, quote, "I first heard Castro talk of himself, his early youth, his formative years, his long days in prison, his hopes and ambitions, with the defenseless openness that comes with shared adversity and exhaustion. It was during such endless afternoons of rain that Che Guevara and I, the only 2 men in camp who spoke French, who read Bernanos, Giono, Camus, Malaparte, became what I will always think of as truly good friends. Guevara, then a mere teniente medico, told me of his student days in Córdoba and Buenos Aires, his bizarre motorcycle tour of Latin America, his role in the Guatemalan crisis provoked by a CIA coup, his brief visit to the United States, an incident no other writer has noted, his marriage in Mexico where he joined Fidel Castro's tiny invasion force, their days, their scavenging for arms. With dark passion, he argued his hatred for the United States, traceable through hotly nursed real and imaginary grievances to an incident in his late teens when a drunk U.S. Marine humiliated and assaulted Che after the Marine began talking up his date and he defended her, unquote. The two spoke French together with Che serving as translator because Andrew, although already a polyglot, did not pick up good Spanish until his second trip to Cuba in the fall of '57. Che and Andrew also spoke obsessively about their mutual love of cameras, exchanging stories about how Andrew had gotten his first Iconta at the age of 13, followed by a Pablo Machina at 16, and how Che had spent a summer eking out a living as a street photographer in Mexico City. Quote, "In a manner of speaking, wrote St. George, he was a fellow professional. For this reason, Andrew gifted Che with one of his 3 cameras on that first trip in the spring of '57, to Che's obvious delight and the subsequent horror of Andrew's wife, Jean, who had bought that particular camera and who was still paying it off. Che used that camera not only to shoot intimately framed portraits of St. George's interviews with Fidel and revolutionary legends turned martyrs, such as Ciro Redondo and Camilo Cienfuegos, but he also supplied the unarmed civic resistance movement with imagery to use in their clandestine newspaper. This practice St. George also adopted out of solidarity. Andrew, nonetheless, kept ears and eyes wide open during that first visit and every subsequent trip to the Sierra Maestra. His alertness made him the first journalist to recognize that the loyalty of Cuba's armed men in the mountains did not so much rest with the anti-Batista, pro-democracy, nationalist capitalism of urban members of the 26th of July movement and its tens of thousands of well-educated professionals, workers, and union leaders, as well as intellectuals. Rather, the armed wing of the revolution's loyalty rested entirely with Fidel Castro, wrote Andrew Szentgyorgyi. Castro's soldiers in the mountains, he said in the fall of '57, quote, call themselves Fidelistas, unquote. This observation, possibly the first, shrouded an ominous sense of foreboding that for the most part St. George did not immediately divulge. During his first trip to the Sierra, he had witnessed Fidel launch a 2-pronged campaign to establish governing authority among local peasants historically located in the mountains and unaccustomed to the presence of a state. To do this, he required oath-taking ceremonies in which Fidel asked crowds of villagers to swear allegiance, loyalty, and support for the rebels, and then he carried out a sweep of the area, trying and executing 29 men whom local peasants accused of rape, theft, and murder. Subject to what St. George called a 5-person jungle judiciary, all but 1 man arrested, so 29 of 30, were shot by firing squads that Raul Castro organized. Obvious to St. George, who photographed and witnessed every step of the process, all of Fidel's men, except Fidel and a Catholic priest named Father Sardinas, were required to participate in the executions. Until they shot their first captive, none of these men had ever killed anyone before. In the summer and fall of '58, only weeks before Batista fled and the revolutionary government took power, the circle of those that the rebel army rounded up, tried, and executed shifted dramatically. Although St. George had once dismissed these executions with the statement, "The jungle has no prisons," the penalty for extreme crimes was death, he privately drew terrifying conclusions. Fidelistas might one day weave the multiple strands of authoritarianism together, ensuring that all possibilities for a just and free democracy would fall apart. Those with the weapons, St. George wrote, don't like to share or give up the chance to rule. Nonetheless, St. George's clear-eyed analysis of exactly what Fidel Castro's relentless pursuit of power and the intensity of his commitment to radical change might mean remains remarkable. While he was certainly interested in professional success, St. George was also convinced that his role as a witness to revolution would make a difference. Uneasily, St. George ended a key report from Cuba by quoting an elderly man he described as very wealthy, with tears in his eyes, who placed all his hope in Fidel Castro, whom he called a, quote, modern-day Simón Bolívar, a new liberator, unquote. Then St. George added prophetically, quote, for the United States, Castro may well become one of the most important world figures. This is 1957. Controlling or influencing some of our most important strategic areas. And this reporter happens to know that the State Department does not dismiss the possibility lightly. Right now, Castro is definitely friendly to us and eager to apply the lessons of our New Deal to rural Cuba, unquote. Ironically, as any scholar of U.S. foreign policy could attest, St. George knew that this wasn't true. But he strategically chose to ignore it. He hoped that the State Department might pursue a different course, recognizing that something happening in Cuba was happening. St. George testified to the power and charisma of Fidel Castro's leadership, but he also tried, in his vast body of work, to insist that democratic principles, pluralism, and the ability to criticize mattered, not just to Cuba, but to every society in the region, including the United States. Andrew began to offer arguments in December of 1958 from the front page of the New York Times that the United States needed to engage Fidel Castro. He personally served as a spokesperson for Fidel on the 11th of December, inviting the United States to send a diplomatic emissary to the Sierra Maestra to negotiate the terms of a partial surrender of Batista's military and a transitional government. Needless to say, the United States refused. Andrew again offered the same argument scarcely a week after the opposition's victory over Batista in brief profiles of the 5 men leading the new Cuba. He contrasted Fidel's amenability to getting along with the United States with the aversion of Raul Castro, whom he described in the following way, quote, Raul, who sports a Texas hat and shoulder-length hair but could not manage to grow a beard, matched Batista's terror for terror in the Sierra Maestra. He may find it hard to lay his pistol down, unquote. Indeed, Andrew revealed what we know to be true in that same piece, January 12, 1959, that Raul Castro was a past active member of the Communist Youth, that he had toured Eastern Europe on his dad's dime, representing Cuba in the Soviet Congress of Youth, and only stopped short of attending that Congress more generally in order to join his brother's movement in July of '53. These were things that St. George never ignored. By the winter of 1960, however, St. George was no longer covering the nationalist, excuse me, something bad is happening. Let's try this. Okay, did it work? By the winter of 1960, St. George was no longer covering the nationalist, wildly popular, but still pro-capitalist revolution's policies for change. Instead, he documented the secret negotiations going on behind the scenes among the very small cadre of followers in Fidel's guerrilla group. He also began to document the secret indoctrination classes imparted to illiterate peasants who filled the ranks of Cuba's rebel army, zooming in on communist instructors like Aníbal Escalante, who had suddenly achieved a military rank that he did not earn. That's also Guillermo Cabrera Infante next to him. St. George also followed Fidel to government-run farms, where he interviewed peasants and photographed them, working while there were military guards holding rifles. He also began to take pictures that were just not acceptable, that did not rise to the occasion, that according to the Communist Party were imperialist, not in their intent, but in their gaze. There was no triumph in these pictures. There was no separation of past and present. There were too many questions, too many doubts. The steady gaze of Andrew Szentgyorgy's camera was simply no longer useful to Fidel Castro or the revolution. So although in the first 4 months of 1959 he had been living with his son and wife just steps away from Fidel in the Hilton, the Havana Hilton, he had acquired the status of political pariah by late 1960. Not for any action he took to publicly denounce the Cuban Revolution's communist makeover, but instead for simply taking too many pictures, whose subjects did not fulfill the party's mandates for portraying Cuba's revolution in allegedly unconditional terms. During only 6 months of 1960, St. George was arrested 14 times. Because he had known Efigênio Almeida, the chief of Cuba's National Revolutionary Police, since March of '57, or rather April of '57, and the days of the jungle judiciary, Almeida repeatedly released him, beginning in February of '60 when St. George documented Soviet Vice Premier Anastas Mikoyan's offensive homage to José Martí in Havana's Central Park, prompting the very last mass protest in Cuba until July 11, 2021. According to a Time Life internal report to staff at the time, St. George took to carrying in his pocket the solid gold medal that Fidel Castro had awarded him and a handful of other journalists, including Herbert Matthews, for service to the revolution, so that he could convince police whenever he was stopped that he was not a security threat, but a journalist and yet a witness to the revolution. Quote, "To our American friend in grateful memory," read the medal, engraved with the signature of El Comandante Fidel Castro. At the time of his last arrest in August of 1960, however, Andrew finally decided to take on Mejera's advice, which was, quote, "You seem to be getting in trouble every day. You better go home," unquote. After being confined in the dungeon-like cells of El Príncipe prison in Old Havana, we have pictures of this, we haven't digitized yet, the prison warden allowed him to escape. Not only did they share a personal connection from their Sierra Maestra days, but the creeping conviction that St. George would eventually be executed if he stayed. That night, St. George fled to the U.S. Embassy and was escorted to the airport. The next day, his growing family embraced him on the tarmac in Miami. St. George's devotion to the truth he had sought in Cuba's liberation struggles never quite left him, particularly as the vast majority of the leadership of the 26th of July movement, men like Manolo Ray and Raúl Chivas, abandoned cabinet positions, careers, and the country to fight the consolidation of communism in Cuba, and tried, unsuccessfully, to do so without the support of the CIA. They recruited brilliant young people like Mirta Borges, shown here calculating plastic explosives and how much she would need to blow up a bridge, and then crossing the street with her Barbie bag. Let's all note that. They recruited brilliant young people like Mirta Borges. But for years, Andrew followed the trail blazed through poor countries of Latin America, haunted by the myth of freedom that revolution, not authoritarianism, had once represented in Cuba. He also tried, initially, to support Alpha 66 and Manolo Ray's Movimiento Revolucionario del Pueblo, the two anti-Castro groups that at the time were the least connected to U.S. intelligence, a rare feat, and attempted to do for them what he had done for Fidel. That is, shadow their operations, embed himself in their forces, broadcast to millions of readers the promises they made of a return to a better, brighter, more democratic and just Cuba. St. George realized, however, that exile activism was riveted by disunity, as the CIA and former supporters of the dictator Batista undermined the ability of progressive, moderate leaders to organize effectively. Most of his photographs, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them, most of them, whatever their subject of this period, were left unpublished, unseen, and unappreciated until now. Cuba was undoubtedly Andrew's greatest professional passion. Reflecting on this, at the start of his career, Andrew wrote that his photography mattered because it made the otherwise invisible hopes of the Cuban people matter. "When I returned from Cuba," he wrote, "for the first time, I realized that millions of people all over the world would see and get a clear image from my pictures of these rebels with a cause. And the thought that I had helped illuminate their struggle gave me the deepest sense of satisfaction I have ever felt," unquote. The wealth of images that St. George's legacy has bequeathed to the world through the generosity of his family and the support of the University of Florida does not speak to inevitabilities or to inexorable paths that our societies necessarily must take during the Cold War or during the present. Rather, they manifest an abiding sense that something always must be done to alleviate the suffering of humanity and to salvage our greatest asset, hope. Thank you. So now I think we start the show, the conversation, right? I'm going to hobble my way over. I'm good. I could sit here. We need more mics? Your mic. So I have a mic. I bet you got questions.
Well, I just want to start by saying something, Lily. And, you know, that stuff accumulated 50 years ago. And for years, I struggled with trying to unravel it. And your archaeology that you've done in about 12 months is truly amazing. And it, you know, finally supplies context for, you know, I think fairly significant historical records, but we're just sitting in boxes. And you have no idea how grateful I am for that.
There were a lot of boxes. Yes, I know. Professor of Colonial Latin America.
I mean, you know, obviously it's a vast collection. What did he intend with it? Did he have plans? What was his? Or just
Interesting
leave it all
question.
there.
I'll let you answer that.
You know, it's interesting because he kept everything, and he kept it in his office, the apartment he shared with our mother, but he kept it essentially in a giant shaggy pile that initially was in the middle of that office, and then over time became the office, so that by the time of his death, you couldn't really walk in the office. You just would sort of body surf the documents and photos that you collected there. So I think he had a keen sense that this was valuable stuff, and I think he would have been. Could he be here? He'd be 100 now. Enormously grateful, as my brother says, with what you've done to organize it, to give it the respect it deserves. But I don't think he himself ever imagined far enough ahead what could be done with it besides maintaining that large, shaggy pile of documents and menus from Havana restaurants and everything else he collected along the way.
I mean, I'll say that one of the surprises of my life was before the surprise that came in 2021 when I heard from Andrew that he had more slides, was the arrival in 2011 to my house in Gainesville of 8 boxes of material that Jean Szentgyorgyi, Andrew's widow, who I'd known at that point for 7 years, told me was trash. But she thought it was some of it was interesting trash. And I went, and it, you know, some of it was organized, some of it was not. And I went through every piece of paper, and it was extraordinary because what I had there were descriptions of photographs that I had seen, but I didn't really know what was going on. I was sort of guessing. And these were the actual documents that a photographer like him from the field rolled around the reels of film, and then he sent from Cuba through the Cuban underground to the United States, to his editors, to the underground itself. And I mean, it was amazing to discover that. It was incredible. So we had an earlier donation of that material, and I used a lot of it to write a book that came out in 2018. But I want to say that I was blown away by this collection because it is so vast. Because when I got it, as I said at the beginning of my talk, from Andrew, you know, we went through the prints, and there were amazing prints, but he had no idea what was on the negatives, and there were thousands of negatives. And Amber there with my little, you know, scan and slide, when she started seeing what was on the negatives, I mean, it was extraordinary. The material from just the trip to Harlem, and when the delegation stayed at the Hotel Teresa, 90% of that nobody's ever seen before. What you get is a sense of how, in that moment, African Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans knew that there was, in New York, a whole group of leaders who believed that there was some kind of path, you know, that there was an anti-colonial, nationalist, potentially socialist path that they could take without war. And they're all coming to see Fidel. But there were thousands of people on those streets, and you don't see that in their faces, you know. So Andrew camped out, as we guessed, you know, night after night. The delegation was there for 10 days. But there were days where I'm sure he didn't leave, and he wasn't allowed to go, because at that point Fidel didn't want to see him again. He had just tried to execute him, you know. But there are some amazing shots where Fidel looks straight at the camera, because he knows Andrew's a good, you know, he knows. So there were nights where that guy slept on the sidewalk, you know, if he slept at all. And that's how we got those incredible pictures of like Malcolm X. Just, you know, nobody at the time, nobody knows who he is, you know, waiting in line. I think that the pictures, too, of Latin America, when he goes to Brazil, he is astonished, and Venezuela, he is astonished about what's happened in Cuba. He's kind of traumatized by it. He's not over it. And he is a witness to all this intense poverty, and he goes and finds the very people, like Francisco Julião, who founded the peasant leagues in Brazil, and he spends like 2 weeks with the guy, you know, and I think that's where he found his sense of fulfillment again. But it was ephemeral, you know. I mean, I think the Cold War also did that to a lot of people who witnessed it firsthand. I'm going to grab her mic.
Thank you. You are the son who is in that picture with Fidel Castro, right? And this was in July 1959?
No, it's about March, probably. March of 1959.
Well, it says that you were at the Hilton.
Well, we stayed, the first hotel, we lived in the Hilton for a couple of months.
I see.
And then we moved to an apartment building called the Volksa. The Volksa was a famous building because all of the gangsters that were waiting to reopen the casinos lived in the Volksa. So my father was the only person who wasn't in the casino business.
Well, we didn't cross paths then, but a few months later, I was there with, when there was this rumor, this was in October 1959, that it was possible Castro would be declaring himself a communist. So what happened was that the whole Catholic nation of Cuba decided to meet at the Civic Plaza. I believe it was in October, late October 1959. And it was a very rainy night that day. But we were not from Havana, so we had to travel to Havana to spend a few days for these, you know, to show how Catholic Cuba was and how this could never come to pass. And so the bishop or the Archbishop of Havana was there, Castro was there, and there was a big mass, et cetera, et cetera. I was wondering if maybe your father had taken pictures of that moment.
Yeah, I say, authoritatively, no. And it was
Okay.
the National Catholic Congress, and there were about 1 million people. He had just left Cuba, and you know, missed it. It was November. It was early November of 1959.
Right.
I wrote about it in an earlier book. And so, yeah, it was unfortunate because we don't have pictures. We should. And there are many other moments. I mean, anytime Andrew was in Cuba, he covered everything that was happening. You know, I mean, you're astonished at like how, you know, things that you only read about or you dreamed you would see pictures of, there are pictures that Andrew took. So he had a kind of blanket panoramic method that if he took enough pictures, he could kind of reconstruct the reality. I don't know that he took a lot of notes unless it was for other people. And when he did take notes, none of us can read them. The world's worst penmanship. But would
I
you
would
have other
like,
questions?
later I would like another comment, but not right now.
Yeah, I was wondering if, just out of curiosity, I didn't see pictures of Celia Sanchez,
Oh, yeah.
except for one passing
There, where she's standing in the
picture
back.
in which she's already part of the guerrilla, but Celia was also very important in the coordination of the anti-Batista in this 1956 or so. Before she became the first woman to join the guerrilla and become also sort of the chronicler, the historian in within the Sierra Maestra. So she became a very important part, including coordinating her Fidel's travel from Mexico and the grandma.
Well,
So
we have lots
I
of
don't
pictures
know, I
of her.
was wondering if there
Yeah.
were pictures of her.
We have lots of pictures of her that are mostly very glamorous pictures of her. So she went as part of the delegation to the United Nations. She was in the picture that I showed of everybody on the tarmac. She's there. But there were a number of these kind of really opulent gatherings to which she dressed in great finery. She's standing behind St. George in the picture, as is Juan Almeida in the picture where he received the medal. We have several pictures of that ceremony. So there are lots of pictures of her. They are not at all like the guerrilla pictures, although he took pictures of her also as a guerrilla. He relied on her. There were two people that he relied on in his very first trip to Cuba and on his second, and one was Celia Sanchez. She gave him a press pass that he could only use with the 26th of July movement. And so he had a relationship with her. I think she was quite emotionally distant from everybody who was not themselves a guerrilla. So I don't know that he had a friendship, but certainly she's there. She's in the cast.
I was curious if Andrew ever returned to Cuba after 1960.
None of us have ever been back.
We should go.
We're planning a trip.
We got to do it.
There was one effort in the early 60s. He got an assignment from Playboy to do an interview with Castro, and that did not come off. As it turned out, it was not. He couldn't go back.
It's to be kind of in the early 70s. He covered Watergate and a number of dubious political events that made him a frequent target of senatorial and congressional investigation. He was called to testify 5 or 6 times for various different things, and he was kind of terrified. See, my father didn't have a passport. He never became a citizen. He didn't have a passport. He had a displaced persons document that allowed him to enter and leave the United States. And somewhere around 1973, he started to be terrified that he'd leave the country and they wouldn't let him back in. And so he stopped. He tried to go to Vietnam, but that wasn't such an easy thing for a person with a family.
He also, in the 70s, published several articles about being hounded by the FBI and the CIA. And one of the great, I think, without reserve, I say one of the great anxieties in Jean St. George's life had to do with the fact that her husband was discredited, erroneously so, as some kind of FBI agent, and that was certainly not the case. And now we have the Freedom of Information Act 900-page file that the FBI opened on Andrew St. George from the moment he got to the United States to the time of his death. And definitely the man was not working for the FBI. He just did have really deep friendships in the intelligence community that had served with him in World War II, and I have no doubt that helped him. He also had a style about him that was very martial. So one of the interviews that Tom shared with me that he had done in the 1990s with his dad talks about him clicking his heels. I mean, as a kid, I guess every time an elder walked into the room, if you were a boy living in Budapest, you clicked your heels. So there was a style about him that made it possible for him to be charming and get along with even really kind of goons in the military world. So to give you a couple of examples, since we didn't have time and I'm hoping to generate interest in the collection, we have a whole set of images that are from, and that I just identified, that are from Andrew St. George's trip to Guatemala, probably 1962. None of them were published. He wants to know where the CIA had their secret training camp for the guys who went, the mostly Cuban exiles who were trained in Guatemala, recruited in Miami, and then sent to the Bay of Pigs. And the man who flies him to the secret training camp is none other than the general and president of Guatemala, Irigoras. And so you have these amazing pictures of Andrew sitting inside this helicopter or small plane. And there's, President of Guatemala looking at Sophia Loren on the cover of Life magazine. And then they land, and then all these pictures of the secret camp. And it really is in the middle of nowhere. It's surrounded by rainforest. They land. There seem to be some U.S. military guys still there, probably black ops guys. But it's all Guatemalan soldiers at that point. And yet, there are some stunning pictures of, these small, indigenous Guatemalan men standing in front of, for instance, posters that say, blend into your background in English. And somebody has handwritten this translation so they know how to put camouflage on. I mean, the other thing that he did was to document the sort of right-wing crazy exile movement that emerged at the end of the 60s. And I just gave you one picture of that, which was headed by people who were known as Batistianos and by the CIA literally described as goons. And one was Senator Rolando Masferrer. And those pictures, they're, of them training in a park in Miami. As I said to Tom and Andrew last night, these guys are also like 50 to 70 pounds overweight. They're all middle-aged, clearly getting paid for this. Masferrer, like Batista, paid everybody. Paid everybody. So Masferrer was also assassinated by the CIA in '76 because it just got too big a deal for the Miami community to have him there causing all kinds of crisis and violence. So the array of kind of access that he had, I think, is stunning. I got to say one last thing, which is he has photographs that Tom has given us of Trujillo's funeral. So this is the dictator of the Dominican Republic, who's assassinated with the help of the CIA by two of his own men in '61 after 30 years of terror in the Dominican Republic. I think there were 10 people at that funeral who weren't members of his cabinet. And it's extraordinary. We have a picture of that, along with the picture of the car in which he was assassinated. That was published, not the picture of the funeral.
Just two footnotes. First of all, the Masferrer did also try to kill him.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I have to interview you.
Spent 2 weeks in a Miami hospital because a boat he was on blew up. Masferrer had put an explosive. So they were good friends. The CIA, I think actually you've shown the origin of the CIA rumor, which was the mission to speak to Che about Quevedo. The government had planned, was going to shoot Quevedo in the morning. The CIA station chief came to Dad because he was friends with Che and said, would you talk to him? Would you say something? Would you explain to him that the U.S. would appreciate it if this man was not killed? And actually that picture is taken because Dad realized that he had to flatter Che first. So he called Che up and said, hey, I want to come by. I'll take some pictures. And he took that picture, among others, and made the argument that they should not, that it would be the wiser course not to execute this man. He always told me that he said that he had told Che, it would be the diplomatic thing not to kill him, and that Che growled in response, fortunately we learned nothing of diplomacy in the mountains. And I think from that, because Che calls him an improbably FBI agent somewhere in the diaries, and I think it was from that. From that first errand.
And it was that's a real pivot, and I don't want to say that I've completed my writing about St. George yet, but that was a real pivot in his life because Castaño, the man that was killed, he was arrested and was to be shot January 11th. And so that's really early. That picture you saw of Che without the shirt, he's in this house in Tarará because he's got asthma, but he's normally up at the fortress in charge of the executions. And the reason that Castaño was a threat to what was ultimately a plan that certainly Che was about was that he was the head of BRAC, which was the Bureau de Represión de Actividades Comunistas. So it's the Bureau for the Repression of Communist Activities. And it was an entirely US-funded agency under Batista. It didn't do anything besides track about 10,000 communists who were secret militants. They weren't the open communists. It wasn't illegal to be a communist in Cuba, and Batista had relied on them, the dictator, on various major occasions in the past. So they also weren't opposing him during the dictatorship. So what did Castaño have that needed to be eliminated? He had memorized all 10,000 names. And so years ago, in Visions of Power, this book that I wrote, I was astonished to learn that in the same week that Castaño is sent to be killed because he's got all the names memorized, there was also another man named Díaz Berzón who had a library in his house with all 10,000 names. And he was the head, he was kind of a crazy right-winger, but he had the names of everybody in the entirety of Latin America who were secret militants. And somehow his house was raided, and all of that was stolen. And he had a press conference, and then he was arrested, or he was threatened to be arrested, so he had to leave the country. So within less than a week, we've lost all knowledge of who all the militants of the Communist Party are in Cuba, and that's January of '59. So certainly it was something that would help immensely the Partido Socialista Popular, the Cuban Communist Party, to operate really without people being able to say, okay, so Fidel is actually relying on you guys instead of on his own movement. But that Castaño moment, that interview with Che, is undoubtedly a very, very big pivot in Szentgyorgyi's understanding of like what they were facing in Cuba, and the internal struggle, really, as it would play out.
I think it's also a key moment in terms of the Americans' perception of would the Cuban government play ball or not under Castro.
Yeah.
And it was a profound moment to say, oh, he's not.
Yeah.
Well, for me, the biggest revelation among these photographs is 1957, when he was in the Sierra Maestra, and the number of executions that took place, and the only two people that did not shoot anybody was Castro and the priest. I mean, that's something that I don't think any Cuban from that era ever knew. Certainly not I. So it's to me, it's very significant. The other thing is, when I look at the pictures, like in '59, Castro is such a baby. He was 33 years old. And I don't think we've spent enough time really deciding or deciphering where did his desire for communism arose. And I remember meeting Don Emilio González López in 1980. He was teaching at the City University of New York, the Graduate Center, and he was retired. He had fought in the Spanish Civil War, and he was from Galicia in Spain. And I remember him making the comment, Castro learned communism from a Galician teacher that had left the Spanish Civil War and settled, I guess, in Cuba, I suppose, through the Jesuits. Now, I don't know whether, how much, but I would trust his statement. But it's something that is so interesting because he was so young, they were all so young, and we can understand with the embargo that he would rely on Russia, or the Soviet Union, because he no longer had access to the United States. But anyway, very interesting. But that particular revelation that's really new to me.
So I wanted to show on this point, this is a photograph that is a spectacularly difficult photograph to have taken of an execution in 1958, and it was selected by Popular Photography as one of the top 10 photographs of the year. So I didn't want to show it because it is just a horror that the magazine itself, has this on the front cover, and this is like the third page. I think it says a lot. I've learned a lot looking at these magazines about who we were as a society in the 50s, and how little we cared. Andrew wrote a lot of really spectacular kind of New Yorker type articles in men's magazines that we have completely forgotten about and sort of discredited, but a lot of veterans would read those magazines from World War II. He wrote a really great article in Argosy, which was a men's magazine, called The Negro Soldier. And it's like miles long, the article, And in it, it's all an advocacy for the desegregation of the Army, which had just taken place under Harry Truman. And he sent a copy of the magazine to Harry Truman, and Harry Truman sent him a thank you letter.
I'm looking for that letter. I haven't found it yet.
We got the scan. He's still looking for the original. But those kinds of articles are incredible.
Look it up.
You know, because when he wrote it, the response of the public was to write to Argosy. So they have a whole section in the next month's magazine of letters to the editor. And about half of them are from guys who say, who is this black man, Andrew Szentgyorgyi, who's saying that it's so, you know, that blacks are equal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the other half were appreciative, saying, this is great, we're so thrilled that this has come out. So the editors themselves responded to those who were critical, saying, oh, who is this black man, by saying, well, Andrew Szentgyorgyi doesn't happen to be black, but he does happen to be a great journalist. And so this is early in his career. I think it's devastating to know that there were also moments in his career where I surely see that he was the subject of great envy. He was Hungarian. A lot of these white American guys who had their Ivy League degrees or their pedagogy behind them as journalists felt like they should have gotten that interview. They should have gotten this. They should have gotten that. And they didn't speak well of him. I mean, those who worked for Magnum in a book later published called The History of Magnum, you know, it's sad to see that they didn't speak well of him, and they were his editors and his colleagues only 10 years earlier. And the only thing that explains that to me is prejudice, xenophobia, envy, and the kind of man that he was, which was not the same kind of masculine man that other Americans were. His masculinity was was a Hungarian. You know, it was different. And so these, to me, it's been a real revelation to read. I've never read men's magazines, and now I've read like 100-something. You know, it's really interesting to consider, you know, that there is this world of masculinity that's also part of history, and how he embodied a certain form of masculinity that was just not acceptable to mainstream, you know, white American society, or at least a lot of mainstream white American society.
One footnote about the picture of the execution, he always felt self-conscious because it's a very blurry picture, and he said the reason it's, I'm being put back, he felt very self-conscious because it's a blurry photo. All the photos that I take are blurry. This is blurry because he couldn't stop his hands from shaking. The camera would bounce up and down.
He also didn't get credit for a lot of what he did. So Time magazine came out in March of '59 with this best-selling booklet that is a history of how well Time magazine has reported on the Cuban Revolution. And 90% of the pictures are pictures that Andrew Szentgyorgyi took, and not one has a credit to Andrew Szentgyorgyi. So he didn't get paid, and he didn't get the credit. And yet he risked his life, as nobody did, to take these pictures. I mean, even, look, this is the one that I showed you. You know, of Fidel checking out the roadside bomb that they're about to, you know. I think that you know, that he didn't get embittered is you know, at least not in the first few years. I think that that's really significant. Speaks well of him.
Yes, this is very. Can you hear me? Yes, this is really very fascinating, and I would like more time to digest it. Will there be a display? Will any of these things, will they be accessible in the library or anywhere else?
Well, so I'm working on that. I have in mind, because I think that the vastness of the work and my own incapacity to really know much about who's a great photographer and who's not beyond my own historical interest has led me to working with Alex Harris, who is a really spectacular photographer and founder of the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University. He's won the Pulitzer Prize. He's about, I don't want to say it, but he's like 20 years older than I am. So he knows a lot more than I do about this period, because this is when he became a photographer. And so I'm working with him to create a book and hopefully an exhibit where it will be the shortest piece of writing I've ever done, because the whole purpose is to put on display all of these amazing photographs. And the University of Florida's lab has so far done a spectacular job of putting into high resolution about 400 pictures. I've asked for, about 250 more, but the ones that you're seeing there that are, the vast majority of them that are black and white, those were made with my scan and slide. The ones that were sort of sepia, those were made at the lab, and they're from the negative, and they have a 3000 DPI. I mean, you could walk into those pictures, which is one of the things we would like to do, is do an exhibit where we can put crowd scenes and people can walk up to the crowd, that is something I would not do by myself, but I think Alex has great experience doing that. And this is what it deserves, really deserves. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Comment.
My wife and I guess about 25 years ago, spent a couple of weeks in Cuba. We were with a small group of 7 people, including ourselves, and we started over near Guantanamo and worked our way across the country into Pinar del Rio, which I think is west of Havana. And it was a very interesting trip. The poverty was really terrible. That said, there were, I can't remember any beggars. If one were to go to India, there'd be people all over you. Not the case here. These people had pride. Havana was neat and clean and terribly run down. The automobiles, they tell us all this crap about, they have these 57 Chevrolets and these 63 whatever. Well, all of those cars don't have American motors. They have Russian 4-cylinder motors. They're not really authentic at all. But the thing that I remember most was the people. Oh, and there was one other thing. If you went from village to village, there was always music. And there'd be people in the streets singing and dancing. And it was really quite joyous. It was quite interesting to watch this. I also remember we attended a lecture, just the 7 of us, and I asked the person who was giving the lecture to talk to us about dissent in Cuba, and his answer was to me, there is no dissent in Cuba. Our government does not tolerate that. So it was, and the last thing, it happened to be over Thanksgiving, and we were in some little village, and we went for a Thanksgiving dinner, our version, and we ordered some poor chicken that was skin and bones, and it was just pathetic. But the country, the people were very, very nice, and there's one other thing. The young people in school either learned Russian or English, and the ones who learned Russian were very lucky because they were able to use it as the relationship with the United States deteriorated. I know this has nothing to do with this lecture, but I think it's interesting color, so thank you.
I wonder if we have time for maybe at least this last question from Miguel. Miguel is the webmaster of the University of Florida's Cuban Studies website, and the two of us have been putting up edition after edition since September. So I feel like, you're as much a specialist as I am, even though at this point you're still in training. Go ahead.
Thank you. So you talked about a little bit about the process of digitization a little earlier, the lab and scanning and whatnot. So I wanted to ask you about the process of in all these thousands of images or hundreds of images, so many events and faces. How do you deal with identifying all these individuals? You mentioned in one of the slides how there were 2 individuals who you haven't identified yet. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you about that process, and also maybe about one instance where you went down a rabbit hole and you found somebody really interesting or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I could say that I had previously encountered at a different institution this very large collection of Andrew's material that he sold in 1971. It is very different as a collection because it doesn't really go beyond 1960, and it doesn't have the same themes. So there's there's a lot of difference between the two collections, but my method has been the same, which is you have to look at the press. I have a good visual memory. You have to be looking at the press of that moment in the same time, made in Cuba, at the same time that you're looking at those images, so you can start to identify who these people are. I've been doing this now for 24 years, so I feel like I know, you know, the dead Cubans in those pictures far more than I know anybody in my neighborhood. You know, so this collection has been easy. I think the hardest part, and I would ask the public to help us with this, the hardest part of the collection are the exiles, because there are a lot of people who had no role in Cuba prior to going into exile, and then they become an activist. He documented, Andrew Szentgyorgyi documented the CIA recruitment, one of the CIA recruitment centers in Miami from 60 to 65, the largest headquarters ever, largest CIA station outside of headquarters in Langley, Virginia, was in Miami, and it occupied what is presently the Miami Zoo, but used to be the University of Miami's land. Nonetheless, they had little outposts all over the city, and according to research by Michael Bustamante, the CIA was offering jobs at the rate of 5,000 to 15,000 per month in Miami. So it was hard to not work for the CIA. As soon as you got off the boat, pretty much, or the plane, you could get a job there. And Andrew was fascinated by that. He also was very connected to those people who he didn't think of as, like, you know, third-rate, you know, anti-Castro fighters or unknown quantities, but the people he had known, you know, who were from the Sierra, who were from the clandestine movement, and those are the people that he's connected with, and those are the ones who he wants to help. But at the same time, he wrote, and we have the documents, he wrote a lot of, rarely did I think he write these things, but he wrote diaries of his trips to Miami. And Jean sent them when she sent those 8 boxes. And in them, he talks about interesting things like the Latinization of Miami. How it used to be there only be one place in the entire city where you could get a good cup of coffee, and he names it, a good Cuban cup of coffee. And by 1962, it's, you know, every street corner. But he went to the trouble of getting to know these new groups of agitators. He went to these sign-up, like, little registration offices, and I was just telling Tom and Andrew, there are a bunch of pictures of guys just filling out the form so they can work for the CIA. But then he also risked his life and went on several excursions of Alpha 66 to take the photographs. He spent more than a year, I think, documenting Alpha 66. There are some good stories that I won't tell because I couldn't tell them well enough. And Andrew, I think we'd all need to have a beer if we're going to listen. That's a great story. But he did have a couple of successes where he went with Alpha 66 and they did an incursion. They put a bomb on a Soviet tanker and it exploded. And so committed did he become that gold medal that he got from Fidel Castro, he donated to Alpha 66 in 1962. And then they desperately disappointed him. And he hooked up with Manolo Ray's movement. Manolo Ray had been the Secretary General of the 26th of July movement action and sabotage units for all of Cuba. 30,000 people were loyal to him versus Fidel. And he was an engineer, he was an intellectual. He had moved from being Minister of Public Works under Fidel to resigning at the end of '59, and then he ultimately created this other movement by '64. He kept getting stopped. 28 times he got stopped by the U.S. Coast Guard trying to go back to Cuba so that he could reestablish an underground that was a socialist but non-communist, nationalist, democratic underground. And he had people still there. So it was, again, a tragic turn, because by the time Andrew decides to hook up with him and Mirta Borges and all of those folks, and Raul Chivas, who had been treasurer of the 26th of July movement, that would be their last mission. They got caught by the British Coast Guard in '64, and were jailed for several days, and then eventually released. And then Manolo Ray went to Puerto Rico and said, "It's too late. You know, we're not going to win here." So that also, I think, signaled a moment for Szentgyorgyi to drop his solidarity with any exile group, and just to stand back and witness the rise of all of these, what became by the 70s, according to the FBI, their words, not mine, terrorist organizations. They were more terrorizing the Miami population than the Cuban population, because they decided that the #1 enemy of freedom in Cuba were Cubans in Miami who wanted to reestablish relations with Castro, or who wanted to visit Cuba. So those organizations, did have a long lifespan and really operated under those circumstances in the 70s and the 80s. But he was not going to be a part of that.
I think we've come to the end of our time, and I want to thank Tom and Andrew for joining us and say how honored we are to have you here, and how grateful that you've entrusted us with the stewardship of this amazing collection. Your father's collection has become one of our most important assets and resources for documenting the history of Cuba, Latin America, and the United States in the 20th century, and it's going to be heavily used for many, many years to come. I also have to thank Dr. Guerra for her presentation and for facilitating the acquisition of the collection and using her expertise to document it so that it will be much easier for people to use it and to find the variety of really wonderful, wonderful things that are included. And I want to also thank Lourdes Santa Maria Reeler, who's there in the back row, who's our exhibits coordinator. And she put together a small exhibit. If you didn't take time to look at it as you came in, I encourage you to look at it for a few minutes before you leave. And then the staff of the Latin American and Caribbean collection are up on the 3rd floor, and they would welcome having you come up and visit the Latin American and Caribbean reading room. That will be the home of the experts who will help people use this collection going forward in the future. So again, thank you all for coming, and thank you for a wonderful presentation and a very interesting conversation. So it's a mutual admiration society. So.